Hey everyone, welcome to the Christ the King podcast. I'm Jesse Miller, and as always, I'm seated here with Jared Buddy. Hey Jared.
Hey Jesse.
Today is a special episode of our podcast. We are not going to talk about the liturgical calendar or different parts of the Anglican tradition. We're going to talk about where we are as a brand new church plant here in Winston-Salem. So if you're listening, this is really kind of an in-house conversation of how are we feeling, what are we thankful for, and what do we hope for this next season for the church? Like, what's the vision in our heart right now? What kind of community are we building? So, Jared, would you get us started by talking a little bit about what we're thankful for? Like, what has God done in these early days of a church together?
Yeah, so a lot.
That's good.
Yeah, I think about the move. I think about the transitions, houses, all of those sorts of things that are really more at this point backstory. So in some sense, they're in the rearview mirror. But I think back even just a handful of months ago, finding the space to worship in, having a ton of children, which is a huge gift to see the number of kids that we have, the essential funds to be able to purchase some sound equipment and starting to figure out what it looks like to worship in this context.
Yeah.
I think about our recent ordination to become deacons, which was a really big step. That's not like in non-denominational churches that just happens overnight. That was a long process for you and I, a culmination not only of a long journey personally, but even just within our denomination. It was a long journey. So being on the other side of that, I think about the baptisms and confirmations. I think about the ability to celebrate the Eucharist. Like, these are really, really, really pivotal things that are different, maybe in a non-denominational church setting where you just kind of set up shop and say we're open and try to do a big grand opening. A lot of this is really essential groundwork. And so to get where we are at this point feels like we essentially have a foundation now.
Yeah.
And that takes a long time to build, but it's a really good place to just look at it and be like, hey, this is something as a base. So yeah, I would start there with a lot of thankfulness.
Yeah. And I think what you just said, building that foundation, is exactly why we didn't do a grand opening or a big public launch from the very first day of meeting together. We wanted to build a solid foundation before we really do a public facing launch. Anybody could have always joined us for worship on any Sunday, but you kind of had to know somebody to even know about us. So now we're at this place where we're thankful for the foundation that's been laid, but we want to look at like, what kind of community do we hope to build now that the foundation's laid a little bit and we're gathering a few families and we're looking forward to this next year of growing the way that God would want us to grow.
I love what you said on Sunday about the way we want to grow and the way we don't want to grow. I think that's a very important thing in mind, right? And some of the phrases that we have used, one of them is from one of the bishops of our diocese. He calls it the calculus of transformation, informed practice, and a reflective community over time.
Yeah.
And I think that is, amongst a few other phrases, at the center of what we're trying to build. And the key point there is the over time.
Yeah.
That it's not just a flash in the pan, but there is a time element to that. I think every other person in the West, wants to push as fast as humanly possible. But we are coming really to this place, as we've been praying and discussing, of in this next season, there are, in a sense, we could call it like 4 levers. There's 4 components that we see. There could be others. Some of these we control, some of them we don't control.
Yeah.
Some of them are things we're working on, other things we need the Holy Spirit to make clear. And I think when we're talking about that culture that we're looking to create, it is, number one, with this foundation that we practice that we have, like, okay, we're settled here. Now, what does it look like over time to see Jesus both change us personally, continue to walk with him closely? And then what does it look like to be a church for the sake of others?
Yeah. Yeah. I think with that culture that we want to build, it is very natural to feel the opposite. So the idea of reflective community over time, our culture tends to be isolated, individualistic, and in a hurry. Like, we want things quickly and now. And even as church planters, I feel that sense of urgency, like, outside funds, and even our own sense of success or God's presence is quite often driven by how things happen rapidly rather than over time and
Mm.
in a very much more natural and God-led sort of way. So like the phrase that I've been repeating in my own heart and mind and in our church is Eugene Peterson's line, long obedience in the same direction. Like
Mhm.
to remind ourselves that the spiritual journey and the
Mm.
journey as a church community is not a quick fix for the soul. It is a long obedience to what God is saying, going after the direction. And for us, I think the direction is becoming Christ-like, building a community of Christ followers who represent him well together. And a part of that, one of the other phrases that we use in the culture we want to build is this non-anxious presence,
Mhm.
this space that's not in a rush, not in a hurry. I think about Jesus, who had the ultimate mission on the earth, was given 33 years, and yet really it was just 3 years that he ministered. And in those 3 years, you never find him in a hurry. You never find him anxious. You always see him moving at the pace of
Mm.
being with the people, being with the Father, being with the people, being with the Father, and never anxious. And we hope to create that community while we have goals and visions in
Mhm.
our hearts.
Yeah.
So, like, not trying to rush those things to completion, but to just trust the Lord and be obedient where He leads
Yeah.
along the way.
Yeah, and this is not passivity. And I
Mm,
think it's essential to say that when you look at the book of Acts, there are moments in time where Paul very much knows. And then there's other times where he is waiting for the Holy
yeah,
Spirit, and other times that the Holy Spirit interrupts. And so we are not agnostics waiting for God to break in.
yeah,
We are connected to the true vine. And
yeah.
this is what Bishop Hunter shared with us like masterfully when he was there.
Mm,
What does it look like to be connected to the true vine? So where that brings us as you're talking about like a non-anxious presence, that the concept behind that is this phrase differentiation, which is Jesus, right?
yeah,
He's like you said, he's able to be in one space. He's with the like he's with the lepers, he's settled with the lepers. He's with Pontius Pilate, he's settled with Pontius Pilate.
mm,
Like wherever he's at, he is not overextending or overreaching. And this is worth cultivating. I have been in spiritual environments that feel like the opposite. They feel hurried,
yeah,
they feel angsty, there's this underlying tension that something is wrong,
yeah,
right? Because of X. And the X always changes. It could be, because of we want more of this or something different about that. And being able to create a foundation that is actually like, hey, no, this spirituality and as a commitment, even as pastors of this church, that we want to be present to every person's spiritual journey in our church. So that's worth fighting for.
yeah,
It's worth like cultivating. It's worth creating that space that first and foremost, this church belongs to Jesus,
yeah.
and our obedience and response to him is not like all the other strings. We want to be focused on Jesus. So let's talk about from that place of non-anxious presence, a long obedience in the
Yeah,
same direction.
yeah.
What are some of the things during this season and into the next season? Let's talk a little bit about these four, what we're calling levers,
Levers,
in the
yeah.
sense that, some of them we move, others we're really at that Apostle Paul place where we're needing the Holy Spirit to make something really clear.
Yeah, I actually wanna start with, the most logical based off of what you just said is, obedience in the same direction, and that is formation. Like, we want to be a community that's not just Sunday morning or right now, Sunday evening gatherings and worship, which is huge in the life of formation for a Christian. Like, the Christian needs to gather regularly and worship Jesus and share in the Eucharist and see each other in that capacity, but we want to be a church of people who um, like the early church, they devote themselves to the teachings of the apostles. They break bread together and they begin to say the prayers. And so, practicing what we would call spiritual disciplines, these things that put us in a place of proximity with Christ, they help us to identify our own brokenness. They help us to be with him, to practice things like solitude. That's hard for me.
Mm.
I always want to be entertained. I always want to be with people and receive affirmation. And so to be alone and to pray
Mhm.
silently with just me and the Father, that is a stretch for me. And it's always good for me. It's a practice that I have to make myself um, live out in some capacity. So we want to be a church that um, teaches and embodies spiritual formation, some practices of the ancient faith, and so that's a
Yeah.
lever we can pull in this next year. We have
And that is happening,
yeah,
especially, I mean, whenever people listen to this, we're now gonna be in the season of Lent.
yeah,
The cycle of this thing really washes over us,
yeah,
like introducing your kids. Like that's the power of
mhm,
birthdays, the power of Christmas, the power of these things is that they happen every
yeah,
year. And so it's not just yeah, it changes us over time.
mhm,
Like on the other side of Lent, you may not feel like what was it, like Fit Body, 90-day Fit Body or something, where you feel like everything is
yeah.
changed in 90 days before and after pictures.
P90X,
P90X, yeah, and every other iteration of that. But these things do change us.
yeah,
And that's something that we want to be really aware of.
yeah. We want to teach on these things and give space for them,
Mhm.
and then invite people into that process with us as a
Yeah.
community. It goes back to that statement by Bishop Wallace:
Mhm.
informed practice and reflective community over time.
Mhm.
We can all talk about dieting and exercise,
Mhm.
and we can say like, oh, I'm going to diet this year, but it really is that accountability factor that tends to push us to the next level. And the same is true of the spiritual formation, not just talking about wanting to grow in these areas of our lives, and see spiritual wholeness, but actually being in a community that keeps us accountable. And so we want to begin to pull on that lever a little bit
Yeah.
and to model that. What's one of the other levers, Jared, that you would see for us?
Well, I think one of the obvious ones that we're experiencing weekly is the location that we're in. And where what that does for us, what we're praying for, hoping for. We've knocked on a lot of different
Yeah,
doors trying
yeah,
to see alternative times and spaces.
hmm,
Super grateful for the spot that we have, that we can gather together, that there's a space for our kids.
yeah,
But there, that is like a question top of mind of like, for you and I pretty regularly, is where are we going to be located? This is a nice starting space.
yeah,
And if we're going to stay here, there's some work that needs to be done to beautify it. But really, like, it's in both of our hearts, and
mhm,
we've got possibility in front of us that we're like
yeah.
hoping to explore. But the point of this, I would say, like on the building, is not like a building for the sake of a building. I
No,
think we're probably all collectively worn out with the idea of buildings.
yeah,
Like that's not really a motivating factor. But what we are feeling is the need for some sort of visible presence, or
mhm,
some sort of like usable space that functions well, and that at least gives us the options to explore.
yeah,
And then from that, if I can pivot,
yeah,
the other two things is, one, we're talking about like the mission of the church. So number one, we want to recognize that when God has a mission, it's not all our single responsibility to fulfill that. Like the
yeah,
church, New Testament is written to cities. So we are one part of God's church in
yeah,
Winston-Salem. And at the same time, we do believe that there is a certain grace that God is going to give our church to help participate in the renewal of all things. And so that is one of those things where we're looking at going, okay, right now we're kind of cornered off into a unique space. And like the mission, this is part where we're really needing the Holy Spirit to pull together.
yeah.
So I'll bounce that over to you for a
Yeah,
moment.
so I think the elaborate a little bit more on both of those. So mission, we absolutely want to get involved and connected with loving this city right now in this season. But we also realize over time, as God grows us as a church, we will discover what is our church's unique charism, our unique gifting, and we want to be able to bring that to the city. And that's going to take the Holy Spirit to reveal as we begin to build a sense of community and family in our church. Then we'll discover, oh, oh, these are the options. These are the open doors that the Spirit is leading us to impact the city with a gospel witness and our presence here. So we want to be sensitive to that. And back to the location thing, we are very thankful for our building that
Mhm.
we're in. but we're also looking at like, what would it look like to have our own space that we could do things throughout the weekend? Um, could we have a space for Sunday mornings, or could we have a space that maybe is a little more central to the life of the city,
Right.
that people see it? So we're not just like looking to build a building or anything like that. We're just
Mhm.
looking for a place that we could potentially see increase, and see the Lord leading us into like deeper impact for the city,
Mhm.
and more awareness. Honestly, just having people be more aware that we are here now,
Yeah.
and we're getting off the ground, and we want to love on our city well. We want to lead others to follow Jesus
Mhm.
in our tradition. So
Yeah. Yeah, and that brings us to kind of the last piece when we are thinking more of a launch, if you will. And our church is an interesting church. And
yeah,
what I mean by that is like cultivating the type of space that we are. We just have to name what it is. Like there's a component of it that certain people are going to be deeply compelled by,
yeah,
the more contemplative, liturgical rhythm, if you will,
yeah,
that is like a safe space to come to. And that is going to appeal to people that are finding that place where Jesus is. And then people find Jesus in all other types of
yeah,
spaces, right? But we're kind of feeling some of these things right now. What I would feel, I've experienced this a number of times in my life, where there's a bit of a narrowing that happens where you start to feel like, wow, we really need the Holy Spirit's direction. That's not a bad thing.
yeah,
I think there is a mistaken sense that maturity in the Christian life looks like you bother God less. Like you somehow get all the answers and know how to do everything on your own. I don't think that's Christian maturity at all. I think that that's like maturing out of a need to walk in union with Christ.
hmm
But when I look at these four things of like our continued formation, the charism or mission that God has for us, the grace of how we're going to participate in God's renewal of the city, how we can join along other churches and nonprofits, and what space is available for us to contribute and serve. When I think about the building, like you're talking about the space there, and then also really like a pivot towards public invitation, it feels to me like we're in this season where God is like bringing us where he's about to speak.
hmm
And I don't know how. Like you look at the New Testament, God leads in a number of different ways.
yeah,
The Old Testament even more variety. But like I really believe and am asking anybody that's listening to this podcast to pray with us that we would see God make very plain and very clear opportunity in front of us
mm,
as we pivot from this group of people just trying to get their feet on the ground in a brand new city, brand new place with lots of kids moving and getting settled into school, to a, hey, now we're actually ready.
yeah,
Like we're up, we're here, we're sustaining.
yeah,
Now it's time to change gears. So yeah, I would say I think God's going to lead us here, and a huge part of that is not just you or I coming down from the mountain like Moses and saying, "Hey, this is what God's telling us."
yeah,
We do want to
yeah,
be clear with
yeah,
what we're sensing, but we also know that we are also trying to discern this together in
mhm,
a sense that, like, you know, what's in front of us. So Jesse, wrapping up here, those are like big picture things. In the immediate, there's a few things that
yeah.
we're essentially just moving forward in the very, very near future as we're praying that God would make other things clear.
Yeah, so there's a few simple things that we think would be very helpful for our community, and one is to have nursery and toddler care for the entire service. Right now, with all the little kids, we have kids class for 3-year-olds to 5th grade
Mhm.
during the message, but with all the young families, it would be
More babies on the
a
way.
lot of babies in
It's
our
awesome.
in our community, a lot of little kids. For the church of our size at this early stage,
Mhm.
we realize we need nursery and toddler care, and so that's something we're exploring some options. Hopefully, get that moving in the
And
next few weeks.
just to be
Hopefully,
clear on that option that we're working on right now, it's not going to tax our church more,
that is,
because that's one of the things. Like we're looking at it going, we want to build this system so
yeah,
that as we're growing
yeah.
and people are coming in, it's not
We don't
stressing out anybody that's already here.
We don't have a lot of staff and volunteers. Like most of our
Yeah.
people are already volunteering. So we're looking at how can we fix this problem. So we're exploring some of those
Mhm.
options. The other thing is weekly prayer, like ministry. We are a church that is what we say 3 streams. We
Mhm.
want to give a space for people to receive personal prayer, maybe a time of prophecy, some kind of moment where they can step away from being in a service that has the liturgy, but a space that discerning of the spirit, what is he saying for you as an individual, but also weekly prayer ministry. We're talking about what would it look like for a men's prayer gathering, going through morning prayers, through the Book of Common Prayer, or even evening prayer, something like that. So we want to begin to establish a regular rhythm of prayer ministry in the service and outside of the service. And then finally, we want every person to grow in their spiritual gifts. This helping people discover their gifts, whether it's through the spiritual gift test or just conversations. Where is God leading you? What are you discerning? And how can we plug you in with your giftings? We don't want people just participating, especially if they want to be activated in their callings and giftings. And so we really do want to, these 3 things specifically, they're not like the big levers, but they're things that we can do right
Yeah,
now
right
in
now.
this season. So
Yeah, I love that last one, that growing in spiritual gifts.
yeah,
God's given us each different talents
yeah,
and graces, and not all of them fit into
mhm,
like a Sunday service
yeah,
or Sunday time. Some of them do, but a lot of things are really given to us for our neighbors,
yeah,
for our week. And we want to be cognizant of finding how and where God's working in each of our lives right now. And just I think about the letter to the church of Galatia, over and over, it talks about keeping in step with the Holy Spirit, which is like
mhm,
super interesting. It's not just following, but it's keeping in step.
yeah,
And that's really the season that we're in. Each of us are always, should always be there. But that's the season that we're in right now, is like keeping in step with the Holy Spirit.
yeah,
And it's not just a general, oh, we know the direction. It's like we're following steps. And each of us should be actively leaning into that in our own lives of like, where is God working now?
yeah,
And that can be super ordinary, mundane, boring. Like that's okay.
yeah,
God may be in the ordinary, mundane, boring. We don't want to try to hyper spiritualize something,
mhm,
but we do want to be aware, plugged into that true vine.
yeah. That's great. I'm assuming that in 6 months or a year, when we come back and do another hopes, vision, um, dreams podcast, it will have different things that we're hoping for. We're different things that we're discerning from the Spirit. I'm very thankful for the season we're in, and we want to be aware and surrendered. So, if you're listening to this, would you please pray with us and ask Holy Spirit to lead our young church,
Mhm.
Christ the King, here in Winston Salem? We want to be discerning of exactly what ministry He is asking us to do here in this city, and we're confident that He will lead us and provide for us along the way. So thanks for listening, and until next time, see you.